I want to introduce John Tapogna. Many of you might recognize or know John from his previous appearances at OCF events. He's going to give us some context on our state, where we are now and where we might be headed in this unprecedented time. He's a great friend and a great friend of OCF and of Oregon. So please help me welcome John Tapogna.
Thank you, Max. Well, Max, you described this at one point as OCF's most challenging year. I would say in your 46 years, this has got to rival the most important year. And if you and the 186 participants who are on this call weren't around, I don't know how we'd be faring. A lot about American history is tied back to self-determination and individual liberty and self-action. Individuals don't beat pandemics, communities do. And I think Oregon is coming out ahead in this. I preview my remarks, and I think it's in no small part because we do have some stronger ties across the state than you might find in other places around the country. So Gina is going to help me with these slides. We're going to move through them briskly, and then we can have some question and answer. So let's go ahead and dig in. Here's what the employment outlook looks like. Going back to 2010, you can see Oregon had a very strong decade and a good run up, and then just a precipitous decline, unprecedented, that we came in from a regulatory perspective and closed the economy in March and April and May in order to save it. You can see employment levels went back to their levels from middle of 2013 and have rebounded, but those gains that you sharp gains that you see here, they're going to be harder to come by as the months proceed. You've got, the healthcare sector came back online, manufacturing, professional services, et cetera, rebounded nicely. What's left is an awful lot of the leisure and hospitality sector that is still going to have a hard time. Your bars, your movie theaters, your museums, sporting events, et cetera, are really not going to come back at full strength until we have full control of this virus after we've developed and deployed a vaccine. So let's go to the next slide. Here's the unemployment picture. Roughly, you can see that huge rise in April and May. If you had asked me and many others back then, anticipation that at this time of the year, we may have still been in the teens on unemployment. So some relatively positive news here in terms of just how far that has declined. We're probably in the 7 and 8% range, which was at the optimistic end, according to the Federal Reserve Board back in June. Important to say here, those are overall statewide averages. For communities of color and especially Black Oregonians, those rates are probably in the teens still, and an awful lot of young and female workers disproportionately affected by this economic downturn. Next slide, please. This was a big surprise. 3 weeks ago or so, the state economist came out and said from March to September, if we compare those same periods to same periods in earlier years, we had record personal income tax collections, which they attributed to a couple of dynamics. Number one is $2.3 trillion of federal fiscal stimulus has to end up someplace, and some of it ended up in personal income tax collections because unemployment insurance is taxable. The other dynamic here is you are beginning to hear of this concept of a K-shaped recovery, where higher income workers are less affected by this. They've figured out how to do work with the virus in the background. It is the lower income, especially in that leisure and hospitality sector, workers who have been disproportionately hit by this recession. They are not big income tax payers. And so consequently, the economists at the state were sort of surprised from a general fund perspective, pleasantly surprised that these tax collections held up as well as they did. So knock on wood, and some is going to take some, federal action going forward. This recovery appears to be on the better end so far, but clearly, another full year of a pandemic to work with before we are out of the woods. So we'll go to the next slide. Now I'm going to transition to just a little bit of commentary about Oregon's history with respect and how we are performing in this first 8 months or so of this pandemic. So let's go to this first slide. This is a history lesson. This goes back to the flu of 1918, and there's a lot going on in this chart, so I'll try to help you through it. If we go across the bottom, those are mortality rates per 100,000 in 1918. And if we go up the axis, that's the change of employment between 1914 and 1919. So that's how much these economies grew. And if we look at the dots, the color dots, the green dots are those communities that put in social distancing and mask wearing, those what are called non-pharmaceutical interventions. And the red dots are those that didn't. They kept their bars open, their schools open, not a lot of mask wearing, et cetera. And in 1918, what economists was found is that Seattle, Oakland, Portland, LA tended to grow. They worked better with this virus in the background and ended up that period in better shape than the Pittsburghs and Philadelphias and the like. Next slide. How are we doing this time? If there were just a couple of slides that I would pay attention to in this gathering, this is one of them. This is mask wearing across the United States, with the sort of the darker pink being the higher the likelihood that if you have 5 random encounters that you're going to come across 5 people who are wearing masks. And you can see that certainly it is strong in the metropolitan areas in Oregon, but it's even much stronger in the rural parts of Oregon, with the exceptions of Harney and Malheur and maybe Baker County, than you see in much of the rest of the upper Midwest or the plains and down into the southeast part of the United States. I think this is an important chart to pay attention to when you think about community action and how a community is operating. And I think about the work that Caitlin is about to tell you about later today with respect to the top report. Economists and others are all trying to figure out this sort of measures of social capital, the strengths of communities and the networks between the humans in them. I think there's an awful lot of information coming out of this pandemic about how we work together to keep infection and death rates low. Next slide, please. This gives you just a sense from the summer of how things were going with respect across the bottom. This was restaurant revenue for dine-in, and then up the axis was a 2-year trend on infection rates across states. See, Oregon was sort of in the middle of the pack there, but way off on the upper right-hand corner, Idaho and Montana. And not only did they have high infection and death rates during the summer, but they have highly elevated rates right now as well. So that is not discouraging smart dine-in, because there's an awful lot of good restaurants have sort of figured out outdoor spaces and things of that, or socially distanced indoor spaces, et cetera. But it does show that we have to be careful again as we go out of our homes, figuring out how to dance and interact with this virus for, what is likely to be at least another year before we're completely out of the woods. Next slide. The good news here, up to this point, this is the mortality rate. Again, remember that one from 1918. Here we are again in Oregon with a mortality rate of 14.2, 600 deaths, 14.2 per 100,000 people. There's only a handful of states below us at this point, Alaska and Hawaii among them. So on that scorekeeping, just as 1918, Oregon doing doing very well relative to the rest of the United States. So let's keep it up. And now I'm going to sort of turn to looking into the future and an outlook. Let's step a few. This would be this next slide is the one slide is I think about Oregon's future and going forward, together with that mask wearing slide. This would be the other one that I'd cut out, and I would put on corkboard above my desk. Our natural rate of population growth is going to go negative later this decade for the first time in a century, over a century. And it already has gone negative in a number of counties, many rural counties across the state, which essentially means that if we want to continue to grow economically and continue to innovate, we are going to have to continue to be attractive to people who don't live here to move here and help keep our communities and our economies growing. We are just in a very different situation than we were in the 1970s or 1990s when Tom McCall in the 70s was saying, visit but don't stay. Demographically, we're in a very different space, and it requires thinking about the economy and population differently going forward. So let's think about this and think about different aspects and trends that may either be attracting or potentially repelling talent in households and businesses from moving here. So let's take a step through some of these. Next slide. This is what, okay, this is a look at demography and population going forward. So what we have here across the bottom are the share of the population in counties across the state of Oregon who are Latinx or Hispanic. And then the 2020 to 2025 annualized growth rate projected by the state of those counties. And then those dark circles are rural counties, the lighter blue are urban counties, et cetera. And what you see here, with one exception, is that especially in rural Oregon, that if there's any expectation of growth, it is in those counties that have a higher share of Hispanic residents, both due to birth rate rates, but also expected in-migration. The exception down there on the bottom, closer to the zero on population growth, is Malheur County. So again, this notion of thinking about counties across the state and what makes them welcoming and embracing and a magnet for people and families, et cetera. Next slide. Here's our, what I would say is our key comparative advantage. And the founder of our company, Ed Whitelaw, always called it and continues to call it the second paycheck, which is we have beautiful natural amenities. So this is one take from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, looking at what makes a nice place to live. You can see, Oregon scores well here. There are actually other estimates that put us, I think, number 4 in the country. If you were to estimate what people were willing to give up in wages to live in a place with the natural amenities that we have, and so that is and always has been part of our secret of how we've grown, is that we are a place that people want to be for those natural amenities. Thankfully, we are not Cleveland or Duluth, Minnesota, or a whole host of those other places in that brown part of the map. Next slide, please. But we do have to be concerned with climate change. We have gotten to the point now where Moody's and other municipal bond rating services, et cetera, are starting to bake in climate change risk into their municipal bond ratings, et cetera. This is just one take that feeds into their estimates of where they see the risk playing out with respect to cyclones, sea level rise, extreme rainfall, heat stress, and water stress, et cetera. A big one for the Pacific Northwest is this extreme rainfall. And as most of you are becoming familiar with, those sort of warm, very wet, I think they call them atmospheric river events that we've been, I wouldn't say enjoying, but experiencing over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. Take it to the next slide. Senator Mark Hass sees an awful lot of ECONorthwest presentations over years, and he's always told me, John, you have way too many graphical charts. Occasionally you need to throw in a picture. And so here's one from September. And that's what the smoke looked like on the west coast of the United States on September 14th. And I'm sure everybody on this call remembers those 8 to 10 days, just unlike anything I have ever remembered living through. Just inability to even walk out the front door and walk a couple of blocks, given the unprecedented levels that scientists couldn't even describe to us the harm that would come to us if we walked out and moved with that smoke. So let's go to the next slide. This is just an estimate from economists looking at disasters over the course of from 1940 to 2010 and those impacts. So if you look over to the right, fire count, just research showing that if we end up in a posture with repeated and longer fire seasons, it will put a headwind on in-migrations. That's saying over the course of a decade, about a 1.3 percentage point reduction in in-migration for regions that had experienced repeated and frequent fires. Let's move on to another topic. Big changes in state and local taxation, sort of either playing out right now or about to play out. Oregon's got some big tax measures that they just passed with respect to homelessness services. Now also thinking about universal pre-K as well. If everything passes, it's sitting on the ballot this November, Portland would become the city with the largest personal income tax rate in the United States. The key here is if those do come to pass, those have to turn into services that households and businesses are drawn to. And so it's that execution and implementation is going to be critical. Next slide. Same point on business taxes for the state of Oregon with the implementation of the commercial activities tax. We went from a relatively low taxing state on businesses up to a couple of ticks above average. It is just a very abrupt and quick change in tax policy in the state. Not to say that those moves weren't good ones, but it's absolutely critical that those tax revenues turn into strong, well-delivered services. Next slide, please. And then I would say I'll end on this with the sort of the graphical representation. We do have the lowest housing prices on the West Coast. So as one is concerned about taxes and things of that nature, nothing eats up more of a household budget than house expenses. And so as we think about sort of the state does currently have a pro-housing supply. It's been considered one of the most ambitious housing reforms in the United States. If we can execute it and keep housing affordable in the state of Oregon, I think it ends up being a big economic advantage relative to California and to Washington. So I'm going to end very quickly with 7 questions. They're not the only 7 questions I have. There are more, so let's step through, jump ahead here. So some questions: can we translate our relative success in this pandemic into a stronger recovery? Do our nation-leading housing reforms translate into lower prices and a competitive advantage? Can rural Oregon seize on an opening and use remote work and telemedicine to its economic advantage? Next slide. Will recent tax increases translate into services that strengthen human capital and attract households and businesses, especially among communities of color? Will future U.S. trade postures allow Oregon businesses to sell into a rapidly growing Asian middle class? This protectionist era that we're in is not good for Oregon. How long will it take for Portland's reputation to recover from too many months in the headlines? And then number 7, were those really once in a century wins that ignited our fires on Labor Day, or should we expect them more often? I'll stop there.